Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to our second panel of our last day. I've been really looking forward to this panel on global Black feminisms. Concepts of Black feminism have informed and helped to reshape fields of academic study as well as political organizing. This panel seeks to present a historical sweep of Black feminist thought and practice. Participants might consider a number of questions, including but not limited to the following. How do historical legacies of race, gender, and justice shape mass incarceration? How have Black women intellectuals participated in shaping Black political thought? How has their participation in global freedom struggles furthered the vision of those movements, including what we conventionally understand as movements for civil rights? In what ways do contemporary forms of racial and gender inequality influence professional occupations? How has a Black feminist framework informed contemporary Black cultural production? These are just some of the questions we ask our panelists to think about, but they're not bound by these questions. So they have been invited to just share their thoughts and their current projects and work. I'll introduce them in the order in which they will be speaking, which is not the order that I have my notes in, so bear with me. Okay, although I could do this. Brittany Cooper is Associate Professor of Women and Gender Studies and Africana Studies at Rutgers University. She is the author of Beyond Respectability, The Intellectual Thought of Race Women and Eloquent Rage, A Black Feminist Discovers Her Superpower. She's also probably one of the most influential contemporary public intellectuals. So please join me in welcoming Brittany Cooper. Kali Gross is the Martin Luther King Jr. Professor of History at Rutgers University, Newark, New Brunswick. Her research explores Black women's historical experiences in the U.S. criminal justice system. She is the author of the award-winning books Colored Amazons, Crime, Violence, and Black Women in the City of Brotherly Love, and Hannah Mary Tabbs and the Dismembered Torso. I just love that title. Right? Hannah Mary Tabbs and the Disembodied Torso, A Tale of Race, Sex, and Violence in America. She also co-authored A Black Women's History of the United States, and her opinion pieces have appeared in venues such as BBC News, HuffPost, and The Washington Post, and she recently guest edited a special edition of Souls on Black women, police, and carceral violence. So let's welcome Kali as well. And sitting next to Kali is Adia Harvey Wingfield, who, okay, I'm just going through all of this. I'm trying to make sure I get them all right. Gee. Is it under Harvey or Wingfield?
Wingfield. Probably Wingfield.
Thank you. All right. Something's not coming out. Thank you for bearing with me. Okay. Who is the professor of sociology at Washington University in St. Louis. Her research examines how and why racial and gender inequality persist in professional occupations. She has lectured internationally on her research in this area, and her work has been published in numerous peer-reviewed journals, including Social Problems, Gender and Society, and American Behavioral Science. She recently completed a term as president of Sociologists for Women in Society, a national organization that encourages feminist research and social change, and she is a regular contributor to Slate, The Atlantic, and Harvard Business Review. Professor Wingfield is the author of several books, most recently Flatlining Race, Work, and Healthcare in the New Economy, and it is the recipient of the 2018 Public Understanding of Sociology Award from the American Sociological Association. Thank you. And my beloved colleague, Mignon Moore, is professor of sociology and the department chair at Barnard College. Her research interests in the study of family, race, gender, and sexuality, aging, and qualitative research methods. Her first book, Invisible Families, Gay Identities, Relationships, and Motherhood Among Black Women, analyzed patterns of family formation in same-sex parent households headed by women of color. Her current research examines health and social support for sexual minority seniors to determine the ways community institutions can be of service to this population. Her new book project, In the Shadow of Sexuality, Social Histories of African American LGBT Elders, 1950 to 1975, charts the development of lesbian identity that is specifically Black. Moore's research has been funded by the National Institutes of Health, the Mellon Foundation, Russell Sage Foundation, and an early career award from the Woodrow Wilson Foundation. Before joining Barnard in 2015, she was Associate Professor of Sociology at UCLA, where she co-directed the Resource Centers on Minority Aging Research and the David Geffen School of Medicine. Thank you, Manuela. And our last panelist, last but in no way least, is Professor Imabong Umoran, who is Assistant Professor in International History in the Department of International History at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Dr. Umoran's research interests include the intersecting history of race, gender, migration, and religion in 19th and 20th century Caribbean, U.S., and the global African diaspora. She is the author of Race, Women, Internationalists, Activist Intellectuals, and Global Freedom Struggles, which was published in 2018. Her current book project focuses on the first female prime minister in the Anglophone Caribbean, Dominica's Eugenia Charles. So welcome, Professor Umoran.
My talk is titled The Interruption of Everything, Toward a Black Feminist Theory of Time. I want to begin actually by just saying thank you to Dr. Kelly Jones and to Dr. Farah Griffin. I was talking with Farah a moment ago and reminding her that 8 years ago today, there was a terrible set of storms in the southeast part of the country, and IRAAS was hosting the Black Women's Intellectual History Conference, and I was a junior professor, very new, and this was a big invitation to come to a conference at Columbia, and I almost didn't make it, and many people couldn't, but my flight made it out of what ended up being a deadly tornado in Alabama where I taught. And that was the conference that confirmed that I was thinking about my work in the right way and that set me up for the intellectual trajectory I have today. So it is really fitting to be back today. So I actually started paying attention to the ways that Black women might be talking about time, the way I often begin to pay attention to things. I was listening to Beyonce. Now, this Beyonce song that I'm talking about is an old song before she joined us in the land of Feminist. And the song itself is the kind of thing that causes feminists to set it off, and I don't mean that in a good way. This song was one of her most well-known anthems and dance tracks, Upgrade You, off her 2006 album. Can you play this video for me? Thank you. Keep the tempo. The last line is keep the tempo, right there. So this song off the 2006 album B-Day is a kind of tongue-in-cheek invitation to her then boyfriend Jay-Z that she could upgrade his entire life, primarily through access to name brand wares. There are all the critiques that we could have of this, and indeed many people have had these critiques, but there's actually an interesting moment in the song that I wanted you to hear where she says, I can do for you what Martin did for the people, ran by the men, but the women keep the tempo. Of course, reinscribing a world where things are ran by the men is not the world we want. However, her colloquial invitation of the wrong verb tense here, ran, which is past, rather than run, which would invoke present or subjunctive, might be offering us a sense that she actually does want the king model to stay in the past. but it is her quip about women keeping the tempo of the movement, about women keeping the beat of Black progress and of men's progress that has always intrigued me. That line deserves, I think, to be lifted out of a song that shows a persona otherwise in progress around heterosexual relations and interrogated for the ways it disrupts the idea that Black men control the timing of Black social progress, of Black gender relations, or of Black futures more generally. On the one hand, Beyonce claims her place as a Martin Luther King of the people, a leader, a motivator, one with the power to move crowds. In the next line, however, she concedes that the movement can be run by the men, but that it is women who control the tempo, the timing, and the beat. In this moment, Beyonce places Black women in percussive relationship to social movements. They become the beat, the mechanism by which the movement, be it the civil rights movement or the circulation of hip-hop culture around the globe, keeps time. Even though it looks as if she is conceding to a political power dynamic in which men are allowed to lead at the expense of women, and indeed she might be, her usurpation of the tempo as the space that she controls subverts these larger racial dynamics. If women control the beat of hip-hop culture, they control the culture, because the culture, especially Southern hip-hop culture, is deeply beholden to the beat. And even though this song is 2006 and I've had literally 13 years to think about this, I would like to add that Black women keep on saying the same thing. So just earlier, last month, the newer singer Lizzo released a song called Tempo featuring Missy Elliott, in which she says, "Slow songs are for skinny hoes. I'm a thick bitch. I need tempo." And that is a fat girl's anthem for sure. And it inspires me to redouble my efforts to get at what exactly Black women are claiming about the relationship between their bodies and tempo. Oddly enough, Beyonce's temporal reclamation left me standing on another doorstep that I hadn't anticipated arriving at. As I discuss in my first book, Beyond Respectability, I tend to take an Anna Julia Cooperian approach to understanding the Black female body. There was something about the way that B laid claim in Upgrade You to Black women's time that felt like something I had heard before. And so here I'd like to posit that the originary theorist of a kind of Black feminist temporality is Anna Julia Cooper. She famously said, and we all know this quote, "Only the Black woman can say when and where I enter," emphasis here on when, "in the quiet, undisputed dignity of my womanhood without violence, suing, or special patronage, then and there the whole race enters with me." Cooper's claim is rooted in a specific Black women's temporality, a particular when, a certain now, a when-then statement that deserves our consideration. This temporality is not conditional in the traditional sense. She does not say that, quote, if the Black woman enters, then the race enters. She presumes that the timing of Black women's entry into previously denied institutions, possibilities, and futures is imminent. Black women's entry is not conditional, but broader racial entry is. Let me also make clear that Cooper's Black feminist temporality is not exclusive. It is less prescriptive than proscriptive, which is to say that it proscribes stories which map racial futures and possibilities in ways that treat Black women as optional. Certainly, there is the question of whether Cooper primarily understands Black futures as forms of integration into settler futures, particularly given her concession of narratives of savagery about indigenous people in the broader text of Voice from the South. I think that that is a legitimate reading and critique of Cooper and her body of work. But I think the conditions that she sets as the originary ground of temporal entry or re-entry militates against this as the only conclusion. Cooper advocates for Black futures and Black thriving that do not have to contend with violence first and foremost. The colonial project does not exist outside of violence, so even if Cooper comes to this through a fundamentally liberal imagination, the reality is that liberalism cannot get us to the future Cooper calls for. Second, Cooper challenges juridical indices of exclusion such that she doesn't want to have to sue for inclusion because she wants her dignity and right to exist to be foregone conclusions. Again, juridical appeals are at the core of a liberal feminist project, and she rejects this as the end goal to which Black people should aspire. And finally, though Cooper is among the Black elite because of her educational access, she does not wish for a future predicated on being one of the elites. She rejects special patronage as the grounds for entry. Thus, she gives us the parameters of a world-making project that rejects violence, official juridical categories, and elitism as the basis for Black living and thriving. But still, Cooper's reorienting of Black racial and spatial and temporal imaginaries as sites that must include Black women open up the space for us to tell a different story. Indeed, to imagine a temporal landscape beyond what Charles Mills calls the white temporal imaginary. I came to Mills' work on the white temporal imaginary in preparation for a TED Talk that I had the honor of giving at the TED Women event in 2016. I had been teaching Sharon Patricia Hollins, The Erotic Life of Racism in a graduate seminar, and in that book she asked the question, quote, what happens when someone who exists in time meets someone who only occupies space? Those who order the world, who are world-making, still quoting Holland here, master time. Those animals and humans who are perceived as having no world-making effects merely occupy space. Mills similarly argues that, quote, whites are self-positioned as the masters of their own time, as against those mastered by time. And because Europeans position both indigenous and African peoples as colonial others, they also view these people as people who were by turns folks without an impact on history. That's Hegel proclaiming that Africa is no historical part of the world. As people who wasted time, that is Kant proclaiming that Native people were a dying race because of their failure to appropriate time and modes of conquest, and as people who were generally outside of the parameters of any meaningful temporal schema. So in the TED Talk, drawing on Holland, I argued that we might reduce this to a story of world makers versus space takers, which is essentially the colonialist narration of all non-white peoples, that we are the space takers while they are the world makers. Of course, the obvious truth is that indigenous folks and Native Africans have been engaged in world-making projects since the beginning of time, and these world-making projects are illegible by necessity to the white temporal imaginary. Mills further explicates, quote, the white settler state, for example, set the historical chronometer or chronometer at 0 to signal that before its arrival, no history had taken place, no real passage of time, since a time in which no history passes is a time that has not really itself passed. That historical chronometer serves the narrative of white settler futures. However, colonial world-making projects aren't the only world-making projects that count. I was helped in understanding this particular idea 2 years ago when some comrades in the LA chapter of the Movement for Black Lives invited me to come and chop it up about gender identities and the movements we are building. I had been thinking about Cooper's assertion in A Voice from the South that the gender categories bequeathed to Black men and women after slavery were, in her words, quote, impoverished and debased by 2 centuries and more of compression and degradation. And beyond respectability, I argued that race manhood and race womanhood and the regimes of respectability that produce them should be understood as forms of gender theorization in Black communities trying to articulate legible notions of the human in the post-emancipation period. To put it in the parlance of this talk, respectable Black gender categories, limited though they were themselves world-making projects designed to create productive Black futures based on gendered ideas available at the time. The Movement for Black Lives is itself a world-making project, and its desire to make new worlds is most readily apparent in the ways it has taken up queer and trans identities as central to its Black future-looking imaginary. So we came together in LA to imagine gender futures beyond the old impoverished categories. In our discussion, I articulated this idea of the problem of the white chronometer, though not exactly in those terms, and an indigenous comrade who attended this gathering said to me, right, you're saying whiteness vis-a-vis colonialism is the interruption of everything. When she said this, it gave me hope. There has been this long-standing debate about whether or not racism is a permanent feature of American life and of Black life. This is Derek Bell's work. But I was reminded in this moment that there will be a world after America. And there are futures other than settler futures. Ruptures, even of the epochal sort, are not the only version of the story that can be told. Whereas the white chronometer tried to rewrite history such that the white center became the site of everything, projected into a vast other world of nothingness, we must not concede these narcissistic inversions. The world was already everything, and whiteness was the inconvenient, violent interruption. What if we understood the project of whiteness as that, as a violent, inconvenient nuisance, but certainly not as the center of everything? And using terms like interruption and nuisance, I don't want to minimize the levels of devastation reaped upon us today by the encroachment of colonizers. As I say this, I know the community I'm saying it in, and y'all are certainly being encroached by colonizers. And some people call them gentrifiers, but let's call them what they are. And the deep-seated coloniality that is, to quote Nelson Maldonado Torres, so pervasive that, quote, as modern subjects, we breathe coloniality all the time and every day. Because as coloniality defined the spatio-temporal matrix of what was called America, part of what I am arguing is that if we take a longer view of time, one that begins with indigenous and African world-making projects, one that presumes that these projects will outlast white supremacy since they have yet to be bested by it, despite all predictions to the contrary, then white supremacy and coloniality become features of this historical moment, but they don't become the whole story. As Black feminist philosopher Christy Dotson argues, quote, "I refuse to live with settler time. I refuse to live without the ability to recognize historical repetition or everyday structures of dispossession. I refuse to live believing, as many do, that this land began with European settlement. It did not. And I refuse to accept the falsehood that every moment after European contact was a moment defined by the centrality of Europe. And though my originating stories on this land begin with enslavement, my creation stories do not. My memory will remain longer than my lifespan." By understanding whiteness as the interruption, as the other, the chronometer gets reoriented so that indigenous and African world-making projects become the field of reference. Within this schema, Black US feminism emerges as a world-making project taken up specifically by Black women under conditions of empire. All world-making projects have to assert a temporal schema, a way of orienting themselves in time that allow for both usable past and possible attainable futures. One of my favorite contemporary poets is Morgan Parker. If you have not read any of her published poetry collections, you should. In her newest collection, Magical Negro, there's a poem entitled "Now More Than Ever," and I've screenshotted a couple of pages of it, because it points both to the intellectual disingenuousness of settler time and to the disjunctive forms of time that shape Black life. Parker tells us, quote, "Now more than ever is a phrase used by whites to express their surprise and disapproval of social or political conditions which to the Negro are devastatingly usual." She goes on, "Its origins and implications are necessarily vague and undefined. In other words, the source moment of separation between now and ever must never be specified. However," she tells us, "in response to the circumstances occurring now as ever, but suddenly inexplicably more than ever, this is an utterance to be met with a solemn nod of the head and eventually, and most importantly, absolution." The problem is that it is never clear how white people come to distinguish now from ever. Parker argues that, quote, "It seems to be uttered in moments of aha, or more bluntly, I straight up did not believe you before, when before equals ever." Parenthetically, she says, "See also Negro lexicon entries 42 and 43, same shit, different day, and same old, same old." And then in the space of this 3-page long poem, she offers a devastating takedown of the problems with settler time. She argues, quote, "Subtext then underscoring this phrase are quite sinister in nature, varying from your usefulness, Negro, is married to your misfortune, and time is linear, the implications of which," I'm sorry, let me see if I can take that back and bring it back again so you can see it. Okay. "Your usefulness, Negro, is married to your misfortune, and time is linear, the implications of which are that, one, value is time sensitive, conditions of despair are temporary, and anything at all can be new, belonging exclusively to now, untethered to ever." She's dope. "Whereas white people can change their behavior based on spontaneous empathy, or as Parker says, when one feels like it, it would appear," she concludes, "that the Negro must live the life of the Negro ever now and ever and ever and ever." And that "and ever" at the bottom goes on for another full page. Parker situates Black time as the chronometer so that we are left with the sense that white people's now is our ever and our now and our ever. It's important to remember here that the solution to temporal disjunctures is not merely to try to assimilate Black people into white time or queer people into straight time. So much of our social policy and indeed our now as ever racial progress narrative has been about catching up. Is this a proper goal of a Black freedom project, to catch up to white people and to get caught up as a consequence in their settler futures? There is creativity and potential in these temporal disjunctures that we should be interested in retaining. I'm thinking here of categories of girlhood and womanhood and the ways Black women inhabit those categories. Note that when, as in the case of R. Kelly's many victims, Black girls get called fast or fast-tailed, what we are being confronted with is the anxiety produced in communities about the problem of a disjunctive temporality. The thing about being called fast is that, of course, it is often a projection, a misreading based on the material fact of black girls who develop faster than their white counterparts. Only when it comes to black girls is being fast or precocious or first considered a problem, deserving of moral panic and policing. But precisely because black girls are often understood as fast, we come into the world being treated as women. Simultaneously, I am thinking here of my great-grandmother and all of our maternal ancestors who were referred to callously as girl when they were clearly women. So when we lovingly refer to our sister friends as our homegirls or our girls well into adulthood, we're both restoring the integrity of lost girlhoods and performing in real time this idea that to be a black girl and a black woman are never distinct temporalities for us. They are always lived in real time at the same time. We are always girls and women simultaneously, our past and future selves, which is why to be present in community with black women and girls is to recognize that we must call forth these past and future selves to recognize that they are always in the room with us, grounding how we show up in the present. In 2017, Representative Maxine Waters sent a letter to Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin. I was going to play the video, but y'all know the moment. Demanding answers about the Trump campaign's financial ties to Russia. When Mr. Mnuchin tried to be elegantly evasive when facing Ms. Waters in a congressional hearing, she famously shut him down by reclaiming her time. Memes and clips of this moment went viral, leading to television show appearances and YouTube musical remixes of the moment. I want to be clear that I think this is a gesture toward what an understanding of black women's and black feminist temporalities might yield us. It is not, in fact, a fully black feminist temporality because, of course, in the future we are trying to build, preserving the integrity of the U.S. settler state is not necessarily the end goal of our freedom project. But now, as ever, in this chronoscape, black women have set themselves to the task of making sure that empire cannot swallow us whole. Maxine Waters ably handles that task every day in Congress, and we can acknowledge the importance of that act without mistaking it as part and parcel of our freedom project. Waters' popular reclamation of her time and the time of every black woman who has ever had somebody waste her time exist in a temporal landscape with Sweet Brown quipping some years ago, "Ain't nobody got time for this," and conversely, our current social media-inspired remix, "I've got time today." If any black woman says or looks at you like she's got time today, since typically we ain't never got time, you should run. That we ain't got time, do got time, and are reclaiming our time are simultaneously temporal postures which bespeak the idea that you don't want these problems. Thank you.
All right. All right, good afternoon. Now, you know, following Brittany Cooper like on a regular day is tough enough, but when she comes with like Beyonce and poetry, like, you know, this is like skating up a hill.
You're Cali Gross, what are you talking about?
Yeah, I'm good. I will abide. So the title, well, first I want to thank Dr. Farrah Griffin and Dr. Kelly Jones and all of the conference conveners for the opportunity to present today. The sessions have been phenomenal, and I'm very much looking forward to our discussion. So the title of my talk is Cardi, Bessie, and Black Badgers, a meditation on the possibilities of retributive feminism. So a few weeks ago, a colleague reached out to me on Facebook suggesting I write some kind of think piece about Cardi B's latest media fracas. Now, I'm guessing many of you know who Cardi B is, but for folks who do not, she is an award-winning rapper, and recently an old video of her surfaced. So my colleague shared the URL with me. So when I clicked on the link, a couple of sort of pressing observations like immediately rushed to the fore. And so the first one is like, I don't know about you, but I really marvel at the sheer breadth of Cardi's posted videos of her in her shower bonnet, her shower cap bonnet, like, you know, in the bathtub. Like, I'm just blown away by it. You know, I think, you know, wow, if only, right? And the second is what Cardi B describes in said video, in that it was eerily reminiscent of an earlier type of crime, one for which Black women in the late 19th and early 20th centuries had been somewhat notorious. And so specifically in the footage, Cardi talks about how hard she struggled to make it. And Cardi, who was an exotic dancer, before she became a professional rap artist, admitted to having drugged and robbed men who expressed a desire to have sex with her. These actions are very similar to the earlier crime of badger theft, right? This is a crime where women posed as prostitutes to lure men into vulnerable positions so that they could instead steal men's valuables. In a number of instances, the men are often beaten and robbed. And so in both instances, past and present, right, the actions are alarming, but also I think they're very much rooted in a perilous set of circumstances that have contributed to negative notions of Black womanhood, especially with respect to the idea that they are very loose women, that Black women are always sexually available. Now, also in both instances, the women lash out at men who either have or who are attempting to participate in their sexual exploitation, right? Especially operating on the assumption that Black women are whores or otherwise less than. And so in my presentation today, I want to explore a few things. First, I'd like to talk a little bit about an early 20th century case because it really sketches the context that helped spawn Black badgers. Second, I want to say a little bit more about Black badger thieves in general. And then third, I would like to sort of consider something I've taken to calling retributive feminism and to explore whether it aptly captures the politics underscoring these actions, but also whether it offers anything meaningful for considering certain forms of Black female violence, and also whether there are lessons that might be gleaned for us about alternative ways to resist. All right, so now on to Bessie, white men, and the state. So in 1911, Bessie Banks, a 19-year-old Black woman, testified to a set of harrowing events that contributed to the death of Matthew McCabe, a 46-year-old white man. Now, a white man that Bessie was being tried for having murdered. In graphic detail, she told a white judge and jury how she had been out on a date with a Black man, Charlie Stewart, when an intoxicated white man, McCabe, boarded their streetcar. After stepping on her foot, she told the court, "He began rubbing me on my leg and hunching me. Then he said I felt good to him. He said I felt good to him, and he said he could use me until I was simple. I did not say anything to him." So instead, she gets up and switches seats with Charlie. Now, this infuriated McCabe, who then unleashed a sort of profane tirade on the pair. He called Banks a whore, he called the couple nigger, boogie, and additionally, 4 other random white men who also happened to be on the streetcar, who apparently, had been imbibing, decided to chime in. So they started singing, "Every nation has a flag but the coon," and "I would rather be a white man instead of a big Black coon," end quote. So Banks and her date make the decision, they exit the streetcar only to be pursued by McCabe, who continues hurling racist epithets. At one point, he also started urinating on the street as Banks described, quote, "coming right behind us, right on the pavement," end quote. So the harassment continues and intensified, and Banks tried to prevent an altercation between Charlie and McCabe, at which point, this is according to her testimony, McCabe called her a damn Black bitch. Banks also testified that McCabe knocked her down into the gutter, into a puddle of dirty water, and that, quote, "When I got up, I felt the blood discharging from the lower part of my body." Now, the attack doesn't end there. With his pants unfastened and presumably his penis exposed, McCabe yells, "You damn Black whore, I would like to ram this down your throat and choke you." And the 2 men start fighting, and Banks testified that it must have been at that point that Charlie stabbed McCabe. McCabe goes down, and the 2 take off and leave this sort of alley, right? Now, Charlie must have apparently fled the state because the authorities were unable to locate him. They did, however, find and arrest Banks roughly a week later. And questioned by the head of detectives alone in a small room, Banks further testifies that once the detective gets up and shuts the door behind him, she gets super nervous and she starts crying, right? And according to her, the detective says to her, "There is no need of your crying and being nervous. I have got you now. And there is going to be more trouble. I want you to tell me the truth, or else there will be worse trouble than there is." Now, Banks had never been arrested. She has no priors, but when she protested her innocence, the detective responds, "Now, I don't want that bullshit out of you. I know all about you," right? And so during the interrogation, he continues to curse at her and told her she confessed. Even though she says she didn't commit the crime, he would write it up as self-defense. He also takes Banks into a room where other white detectives are sitting wearing masks. As she describes, "They taken me in this big room there and stood me up in front of those men that had those masks on. That frightened me too, because I had never seen anything like that before." So under duress, Banks signed a confession taking blame for the crime. Now, considering the use of foul language, bodily threat, and the sinister parading of Banks before a room of masked white men, there are significant parallels between the treatment that Banks received from an otherwise, belligerent white man and that of the Philadelphia detectives who interrogated her. Right, so McCabe's attack on Banks gestures toward the sort of symbiotic nature of gendered anti-Black violence as enacted by individual white men and the carceral regime, in the sense that McCabe knew he could sexually terrorize Banks because the carceral regime almost exclusively protects and serves white patriarchy. Likewise, Philadelphia detectives could coerce Banks in racist, violent, gendered ways precisely because she was a Black woman accused of taking the life of a white man, right? And so violence in both scenarios abound. But also significant is the gaze, right? The ways in which white men saw Banks, right, as a whore, as a Black bitch. And even though she had no prior record and was gainfully employed, right, recall what this detective says, right? "I know all about you," right? So that type of supposed knowledge about Banks, about Black women, I believe is really what sort of fuels Black women's badger theft, right? So let me explain. So now on to the badger game. So again, badger theft itself is not unique to Black women. But in Philadelphia, Black badger thieves seem to expressly target, assault, and rob white men. Now, in many ways, it was an angry, violent sort of crime, yet for the Black women who committed it, it also signaled their desperation and extreme poverty. And please know, the latter is not meant to minimize the predatory nature of the crime. For example, as early as 1860, Georgiana Coleman, a Black woman on trial for badger theft, made a fairly resolute admission to the judge who chastised her for appearing before him yet again for the same crime. She told him that she would rob any white man who went with her, right? They might send her to prison for it, but she will come out and continue to play the game, right? But here's the thing. She didn't go to prison for it. The charges are ignored, right? And that happened routinely because Black women were regarded as the lowest of the low, right? The most vile and immoral of women, right? Interracial sex was with them, at least publicly, right, taboo. So much so that when white men tried to bring charges against Black badger thieves, the justices usually castigated the white men, right? As far as the judges were concerned, white men seeking sex with Black prostitutes got what they deserved, right? You know that old adage, what happens if you lay down with dogs?
Get up with
Come
fleas.
up with fleas, right? So this is the attitude that the court has with respect to these white men. Now, as one judge told one white man, Mick Albright, in 1881, now Mick Albright was attempting to have a sex party with 3 Black prostitutes who turned out to be badgers and robbed him instead. The judge tells him, and I quote, "If there was anything which would justify the reestablishment of the pillory and whipping post, it would be that such a man might be publicly and properly punished." All right? Now, say what you will about the judge's harsh indictment of Mick Albright's character, but he was definitely onto something when it comes to Albright's shamelessness, right? Part of what made badger theft for such an ingenious crime is that it's highly likely that most of the men who were victimized actually rarely went to the authorities, right? Few of them wanted to be known for having been bested by a woman, period, let alone face the public stigma of their aims to sort of sleep with Black prostitutes. Plus, even those that did usually got a tongue lashing from the court, and the charges against the women involved were ignored. So in this sense, Albright was an anomaly. But still, given their chances of getting away with it and the reasons why this was so, we start to get a real insight into the analytics of Black badger women here, right? Clearly, they understood the racial and sexual dynamics in the society as well as in the criminal justice system. Now, even when they are sentenced, most only did a month or two in county. Only those badgers who ended up seriously injuring men served longer sentences in the penitentiary. But also, the Black female badgers exposed white men's and white society's hypocrisy, right? At the same time that I think they sort of pushed back against this prevailing rhetoric about their womanhood, right? Meaning that Black women, again, who are routinely maligned as immoral and low, yet it's white men seeking them out, right? Ready to pay for sex. So they manipulated the white man's purported knowledge and gaze, right? Okay, these men see a whore when they see a Black woman. So these Black women lead them into dark alleyways where they end up, they might have their way with the white men, right? Lashing them back and capitalizing too. Right? And for the badgers, whose only real employment options at this time are sort of low-paying domestic service jobs, where they actually risk, sexual assault in white homes, or criminalization anyway. If something goes missing in these white homes, these are the first folks that get blamed, right? So the financial payoff for Black badgers that really kind of made it a win-win. Working from sun up to sundown for quote unquote slaves' wages in white homes might earn them between $12 and $16 a month, right? By my calculation, the average Black badger score was $30 in one shot, right? So it's twice the wages working 5-6 days a week, right? But still, I don't think it was purely a money thing, right? But is it a retributive feminism thing? So now I want us to sort of consider whether or not these actions can be kind of understood as this retributive feminism. And I'll explain how I've sort of come to this phrasing. So I see Black badgers' actions as being in the feminist orbit because they are centered in Black women's experiences, right? I think these Black women are critical thinkers who are intellectual knowledge producers and in their own ways are engaged as political subjects, right? Their acts are concerned with agency and also a just reckoning, right? And I don't use the word sort of justice or legality because I think for Black badgers, those notions have been largely discredited, right? And so too have mainstream notions of morality and respectability. Right? I think that they see sort of violent, racist, gendered hypocrisy that is encapsulating their lives, and they know it's not okay. But they have limited power and reach, right? So this isn't the feminist praxis that's gonna bring about structural change necessarily, right? Or that's gonna liberate Black people in all of these really important and intersectional ways, right? That's not where these women live, right? I think this is a feminism that is about hitting back. I think it's a feminism that's about striking against their own poverty, but also in a way that inflicts pain on men in positions to potentially exploit them, particularly in gendered ways. So in the case of the badgers of old, they were dealing with the white men who claimed to know all about Black women, right? Except they failed to realize that these particular Black women know a whole lot about white men too. Enough to enact a measure of vengeance, enough to extract and to shame and humiliate them, right? Economic access may have been the optimal destination, but retribution is fueling the vehicle. It is messy and problematic and against the law, but I think it has some compelling aspects too, right? Black badgers don't seem to bother playing by certain rules since they know that the game is fixed. Despite incredible odds, they managed to credibly challenge their marginalization, both through violence, but also by using the biases of the state, right? But also patriarchy too, in that they counted on the men being too prideful to report, right, that, to the police that a woman took them, right? I also think that by fighting back in the ways that they did, it allowed them to both improve their financial positions, but also it allowed them not to be victims. So now, I think there's room for debate as to whether Cardi B can be considered a retributive feminist, if we even think retributive feminism is a thing. But I do think if we could resurrect and interview a Black Badger of old, the two would sound very similar when it comes to discussing their crimes and articulating the reasons why. And with that, I will end with a quote from Miss Cardi B's said video communique. There's a quote, "I had to go strip. I had to go, oh yeah? You wanna fuck me? Yeah. Let's go back to this hotel. And I drug niggas up and I robbed them." Thank you for your time.
So crunk. That was awesome.
It's a risk, baby.
All right, talk about difficulty following someone. Thanks for that. Seriously, thank you to Professors Jones and Griffin for the invitation to be here today. I'm excited to present some of my recent work, which is a phrase that apparently we're going to hear a lot of today, reclaiming my time, Black women, resistance, and increasing inequality. And since Brittany has already given a little bit of background for reclaiming my time, I don't need to go into a lot of detail, and probably we all were familiar with either watching the original footage or the viral clips that Maxine Waters gifted us with in her dismissal of Stephen Mnuchin's evasions and distortions and falsehoods. So what I do with this paper is to argue that this concept of reclaiming my time actually can serve as a metaphor for understanding and making sense of Black women's contemporary activism, the way in which Black women's contemporary activism is particularly useful and significant at this present point in time with increasing social stratification, and how that serves as a model for what we might look at in terms of activism and leadership and work in the present era. So this argument builds on arguments and theories from Black feminist sociology. We know, as people with some familiarity with it, I'm assuming, that Black feminist sociology in general does a lot of things, but one of the core things that it does is to focus on centering Black women's experiences and voices. And sociologist Patricia Hollins has argued very persuasively that the Black feminist approach and the attention to the intersections of race, gender, class, sexuality, and other factors gives us a more useful lens and perspective for making sense not only of sociology, but also for other social institutions and areas where sociology and other fields might draw conclusions that could be considered maybe less accurate or that could benefit from additional nuance from taking a Black feminist approach. When it comes to work, for example, Hollins argues that some of the ideas that we have about ways in which work serves certain inherent values and the ways in which work functions as something that can provide benefits and supports to people may be a little bit more complicated if we think about how intersections of race and gender and class have shaped the type of work that Black women have historically done and the value that has been placed upon their labor and the value that they take from their labor. When it comes to activism, Hollins argues that Black women have often been very central in various types of activism that often don't necessarily receive the attention and credit that they deserve. When it comes to self-definition, Hollins argues that Black women have consistently tried to engage in shaping efforts at self-definition that run counter to some of the contemporary controlling images that have historically been used to define them. So what I want to think about in this talk are ways that various social changes have affected these topics, particularly work activism and self-definition, how Black women are reclaiming their time in all of these areas, and what it would mean for us to follow Black women's leadership as they go about reclaiming their time in these particular areas and in these particular settings. So we can talk about work, activism, and self-definition as areas that Hollins discussed when it came to Black feminist sociology, as well as other areas that she talked about that I don't touch on in this presentation. But today, it's important to think about how social, political, cultural, and economic shifts have altered the landscape that was present when Hollins was originally writing Black feminist thought. We can point to ways in which Black women are still, or that Black feminist thought gives us new insights into how Black women women are engaging with work, with activism, with self-definition, and so forth. But in order for that to really be useful in the contemporary context, we have to think about what sorts of social and political changes have occurred and have emerged, and what that means for the landscape that Black women are facing. So we know today, for example, that in as much as Black women continue to engage in struggles and activism when it comes to work, this is characterized by a new economy that looks a little bit different. It's characterized by increasing inequality. It's characterized by a heavy reliance on contingent labor and uncertain work. We know, for example, that when we talk about the political sphere, that politics today is characterized by more political polarization than perhaps have been present in previous eras before there were diverse groups that were actively engaged or formally engaged in the political process. We're having different conversations around sexual identity. We experience a growth of new media. So all of these things today, I think, put into place a different landscape in which Black women reclaim their time than what was present when Hollins was writing. And it's certainly true, I think, that the arguments that she was making in 1990 and in 2000 when the second edition of her book was published are still viable and still very valid. But if we want to think and talk about how Black women are engaging in work and engaging in activism and engaging in self-definition, it's necessary to put those things in the context of these shifts that are happening today. So we have to think, what does Black women reclaiming their time, what does Black women's effort and agency and work look like in an environment where work has shifted to this new economy, where so many of the structures and pathways towards certain types of work, the schism between good jobs and bad jobs has opened up. What does reclaiming their time look like in that context? What does Black women's activism and political work look like in an era of a certain character and nature of political participation? What does Black women's self-definition look like in an era where there is a growth of new media, where there are new forms of an access to media content and new types of representation that are present? In other words, the question that I ask in this presentation is, how are Black women responding to these structural issues? And I argue that reclaiming their time gives a useful metaphor for thinking through what this work looks like and what Black women are doing in response to these sorts of structural changes. So in as much as we talk about the ways in which social structures have shifted and presented this growing picture of polarization and stratification, essentially the argument that I'm making here is that Black women are engaging in reclaiming their time in ways that offer us a model for reacting to and responding to this sort of ongoing stratification and the ways in which it's created a new sort of social structure. So taking this kind of institution by institution, if we think about work and labor markets, we know, for example, that there has been a long history of Black women's long-term precarity in the labor market. This was true, obviously, during the era of slavery. This was true during segregation. And this continues to be true despite the fact that post-civil rights era gains have lowered some of the most overt barriers towards Black women. So even though we are in this post-civil rights era where it is now technically illegal for explicit overt discrimination to occur, this hasn't really created a model or a widespread transformative shift for what this means for Black women in work. Black women still tend to be disproportionately stereotyped as single moms or as angry Black women, and this has implications for their access to certain jobs, their entryways into certain professions, and the types of experiences that they have in these workplaces. My colleague, sociologist Cedil Malaku, argues that Black women face exclusion from key social networks in the legal profession, which makes it difficult for them to access and integrate into this field in particular. Colleagues Rossino, Wilson, and Huffman have shown that the shrinking public sector has had a specific impact on Black women's work, in as much as the public sector had historically been an area where Black workers, both men and women, could somewhat reliably count on stable middle-class jobs. And ultimately, the Bureau of Labor Statistics documents that Black women are concentrated in low-wage service work. And again, this has been pretty consistent for a lengthy period of time. Ever since Black women have been working, they've disproportionately been represented in this sort of low-wage service work and in the types of jobs that carry the lowest pay and the least status and the least prestige. So despite the changes that have occurred in the new economy, the picture of Black women's work still remains pretty bleak, in large part due to the structural consistency of how economics and labor markets have been shaped. But what does this mean for what Black women are doing? I argue that despite the ways in which structural conditions remain very bleak and disadvantageous for Black women, they still are engaged in this project of reclaiming their time when it comes to work. What does this look like? I found in some of my own research that Black women in professional jobs are actually doing exorbitant amounts of labor to change the workplaces in which they are employed. They do this by devoting time to mentoring younger Black women. They do this by advocating for other women, particularly women of color. And this is a point that is particularly key in the new economy, which refers to, again, a period of time where there's much more of a focus on individualism as opposed to collectivism, where the effort is to shrink the public sector and to focus on austerity measures and making sure that organizations and profits become much more valued than work and workers. And in the new economy, one of the trajectories that has taken place is that there's much more of an emphasis on kind of self-direction and workers being individualized and autonomous in terms of their access to gaining employment and gaining access to certain jobs. So when Black women are engaged in these projects of trying to restructure and reshape their workplaces, particularly professional Black women, they're actively trying to create workplaces that are much more equitable and much more egalitarian and much more open and welcoming to other women of color. And they do this, as I would assume many of us know, often in the face of enormous odds and in the face of significant resistance. But I argue that this functions as an example of Black women attempting to make workplaces more equitable and more fair and trying to address the fact and respond to the fact that workplaces have become less so in many contexts. And this is not limited to Black women who are in professional jobs. For Black working class women who were heavily involved in the fight for 15, the efforts to exact a living wage for doing service work, these were efforts to create conditions that would lead to more economic security for workers in these settings overall and at large. So what we see when it comes to the discussions that we have about work and how work is changing in ways that are making many of us more insecure, more uncertain, more economically unstable, Black women are the people who are at the forefront of leading the fights to make workplaces more equitable, more fair, more just, and more amenable to workers of a variety of backgrounds. When it comes to politics, this is perhaps where we see some of the starkest examples of ways in which Black women are reclaiming their time, particularly in the face of enormous odds. When it comes to politics, the landscape today looks somewhat like work in terms of the ways in which the political landscape has become often very bleak and very challenging. We see this with regard to voter suppression tactics that have become much more commonplace, including but not limited to voter ID laws, attempts to close polling places in predominantly Black communities, and shorten voting times, all of which are documented to be examples of cases where those in positions of power have attempted to either dilute, minimize, or constrain Blacks' voting power by simply making it more difficult for them to have access to that voting power. And we also have seen a lack of party support for Black women candidates over a long period of time, particularly when Black women were interested in electoral politics. So we, again, see and talk about the ways in which the political structure has become much more hostile, unwelcoming, polarized. What are we doing about that? What are groups, or what are groups that are active in trying to make these changes doing? For Black women, again, we see that reclaiming their time becomes a way in which they are providing essential and core leadership to addressing the ways in which the political sphere and the political structure has been hostile and unwelcoming. Black women do this often through their voting records and through their voting patterns. They're much more likely to support policies that expand access and opportunity when it comes to voting rights, healthcare, gun control, and ending mass incarceration. And I think we saw some of the clearest examples of this in Black women's voting power recently when it came to decisively shifting close elections. For example, the case of Alabama provides a clear example of Black women's influence and ability to shift a close election when it came to an election between Doug Jones, a Democrat, and Roy Moore, a Republican, who was credibly and multiply accused of sexual assault by several women, a fact which did not provide enough of a dent in his support from white constituents in the field to actually keep him from a Senate seat. It was Black women whose turnout, whose voting power, whose determination to vote for his opponent actually sent the state to sent democratic representation to the state for the first time in over 50 years. In New Jersey, a similar outcome emerged with the governor of the state when black women's voting participation and voting work served to maintain the governorship and making sure that it stayed in Democratic hands. I also thought about mentioning Virginia here, but I'm not going to because blackface, but that serves as an example as well of black women's core work and making sure that that their voting power kind of takes precedence. And we also have examples of black women's active involvement in electoral politics. Here in New York, Letitia James' status as the first black woman, first black person and first woman to serve in the Attorney General role. Lucy McBath in Georgia flipped a district and became a representative in in a House district in Georgia that I think will be for the first time represented by a black woman. And it's important to note here that these are black women who are running for office but not shying away from what race and gender mean to them in their own lives and work and in their experiences. In Lucy McBath's case, she didn't have a choice about this. Her son, Jordan Davis, was one of many young black men who was shot without provocation, in this case not by a police officer, but by a white stranger who demanded that Jordan and his friends turn down their music, and when they didn't, retaliated or responded by shooting into their car and killing Jordan. So these are examples of black women who are engaged in electoral politics and trying to shift and change the system without trying to compromise or downplay or lose focus of how race and gender have an impact. And of course, I would be remiss if I did not mention my Spelman sister, Stacey Abrams, running for governor of Georgia. I'm still a little bitter about that, so I won't get into too many of my feelings. But again, this is an example of black women being involved in this sort of electoral work and attempting to shift the political process by actively being part of the political process. And lest we assume that black women are only involved in reclaiming their time when it comes to politics or electoral politics, it's also important to note that when we think about a lot of the social movements today where that have been responsible for changing some of our conversations and shifting some of our discussions and assessments that we're having about social issues, black women were and continue to be at the forefront of some of the most major ones. Black Lives Matter, Say Her Name, Me Too, Mute R. Kelly. These are all examples of black women being active in social movement activity and social movement work and drawing attention to the ways in which race and gender matter and trying to show leadership and showing leadership, rather, as to how these sorts of issues need to be addressed and discussed and how they need to be harbingers for change. When it comes to media and self-definition, Hollins talks about the representation of the mammy, or in her updated version, the modern mammy, this representation of black women who are just so focused on caring for white families and institutions that they can think of nothing more that they like doing with their time and with their energy. There's the representation of the matriarch, the vision of, or the controlling image of black women who do a subpar job caring for their own families because they just simply don't have the skills and the capacity to be good mothers. There's a representation of the Jezebel, the sexually available black woman. There's the representation of the welfare mother who exploits and takes advantage of government and political systems in order to kind of game the system and usurp the work of legitimate taxpayers. And there's a representation of the black lady who is so far removed from these sorts of racial and gender issues that exploitation doesn't bother her. How are black women reclaiming media? They are moving to a place where, rather than simply being in front of the camera are now a lot more involved in serving as content creators. We have examples of Issa Rae with her television show Insecure, Janet Mock with her show Pose, Shonda Rhimes with one of what seems like a new show that comes out every other week, How to Get Away with Murder, but also many other examples. And again, I'd like to point out my sociologist colleague, Eve Ewing, who is writing a Marvel comic, Ironheart, and again, giving us examples and representations of depictions of black womanhood and black femininity, and engaging in this project of self-definition in ways that look very different from the sort of controlling images that are often imposed on black women by external forces. Why does this matter? Why is it necessary to think about the ways in which black women are engaged in these projects in the workplace, in labor markets, in activism, in media when it comes to self-definition? I argue here that black women in this process of reclaiming their time are actually creating important structural change. When we think about, as I mentioned, the ways in which social structures are fundamentally and inherently unequal, and when we lament the ways in which social institutions are operating in ways that are exploitative, that are oppressive, that are damaging, When we think about how these things are occurring, we also have to think about who is doing the work to change those institutions and change those structures. And I argue here that Black women have and continue to be at the forefront of this, and that a Black feminist approach allows us to see the way that they are actively and consistently engaged, often with little recognition and attention, to trying to be in this process of reclaiming their time to change these institutional structures. Black women are creating more equitable workplaces, they are altering the political landscape, they are shaping social movement activity, and they are redefining representations of Black femininity. So the question that I think bears asking at this point is, what would happen if we actually followed their lead? Given that Black women are engaging in all of these processes and all of these actions and endeavors to create change, what would it take to actually listen more to Black women and to follow Black women's lead and to be more in line with the efforts in which they are engaging? What needs to happen for this to occur? So this is obviously an incomplete list, and I don't have a chance or time to encourage or to address every group here. But when it comes to listening and learning from Black women, there are things that we can draw from other researchers and scholars, and ideas that I think bear discussion. For white women, sociologist Robin DiAngelo is not the first to come up with this term, but it is useful to employ some aspects of her arguments for white women, that it is important to stop with white tears. And I'm going to assume with this audience we all know what I'm talking about here, and that I don't need to go into a definition. But for white women, intersections of race and gender can often make it very difficult and very challenging for them to, one, listen to Black women, and to center Black women's experiences without centering it, or without recentering their own emotions, feelings, and sense of being attacked and being called out in certain ways. For white women in particular, the challenge, I think, or one particular challenge, is to realize that white tears are not useful and they are not helpful, and that they don't further this project of actually listening to and following Black women. For Black men, I think it's important to be mindful of how social movements and efforts for racial justice need to be inclusive of and center Black women if they're going to be successful. If we're going to talk about how Black lives matter, then we also have to say her name, and we can't do one without the other, and we can't do one effectively without the other. When it comes to white men, it's important not to minimize intersectional paradigms, dismiss these as grievance studies or identity politics or other labels that make it easier to cast them aside. And for Black women, I think it's important to remember other axes of inequality besides race, gender, and class. One of the things that's interesting about Patricia Hollins' work is that this triad often becomes the limit and the marker of what Hollins describes. But if you read her work, she actually is a lot more detailed about how race, gender, and class matter significantly, but she also talks in a lot of depth about immigration, nationality, sexuality, and other factors. And I think it's important for Black women who are reclaiming their time and who, as I argue, are at the forefront of these sorts of social movements to be mindful of the fact that we must not replicate the same sorts of hierarchies and stratifications that other groups have done in dismissing us. So my conclusions are that we know that inequality is increasing in the United States. This is simply a sociological fact, and it's something that a lot of pundits and politicians and policymakers put a lot of attention into and talk about and kind of knit their brows and worry about. But Black women's efforts at reclaiming their time are actually a really viable model for challenging this inequality, as it has been for many years. Black women provide a template for changing social institutions. They can offer leadership for addressing growing stratification. So the question that I leave with, again, is that if Black women are engaged in this process of reclaiming their time, that gives us a model for reducing stratification and inequality, the question that we should ask is whether others are willing to follow. Thank you.
Hello. I just want to say that I was also at that conference 8 years ago, which I didn't realize was 8 years ago today, towards an intellectual history of Black women. I finished a major project and was starting a new project, and it was so encouraging to be there and to hear really smart people talking about and centering Black women's experiences. And it was definitely a turning point in my career. I was at UCLA at the time, but I had a long relationship here at Columbia. I'm happy to still be part of things here. So today, I'm sharing some thoughts from one chapter of my new book project, In the Shadow of Sexuality, Social Histories of African American LGBT Elders from 1950 to 1979. And In the Shadow of Sexuality offers a sociological perspective on the experiences of a group of women who really stand at the juncture of African American and LGBT life. They entered adulthood in the 50s and 60s and 70s, and as individuals with same-sex desire coming of age in 3 different eras, each defined by their own cultural contradictions and racial unrest, these women grappled with how to understand their lives and the ways that they fit into the world. My broader framework for the study of Black lesbians is the examination of the intersections of race, sexuality, and socioeconomic status as they shape the construction and experiences of identities, behaviors, and social relationships. The story is not just an explanation of the leftover spaces that Black lesbians claimed when they were excluded from the social institutions for whites that were being developed around lesbian and gay identities. It's also a story of the strength and tenacity of sexual identity as a social force that organizes our world more generally. And so in the work, I argue that even under extreme social repression and exclusion based in race, sexual orientation, as well as gender, the social worlds of Black sexual minority women were still shaped by their common ties in race and homosexuality. So in the first stage of my research, I conducted interviews with Black women and men who self-identify as lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, in the life, or same-gender loving. They were born in 1955 or earlier, and they were living in Los Angeles or New York. The average age of my study participants was 65, and they ranged in age from about 54 to 81 years old. In the second stage, I incorporated life histories of Black working-class lesbians and white working-class lesbians that I uncovered from several other archives, 2 of which are listed here, and these are the materials that I'm using for the work I'm presenting today. These women lived in Detroit and in upstate New York during the same period that I'm studying, and they were born during a similar time span, and I'd love to talk to you in the Q&A about the archives as a person who's not that familiar with archival research. So in this work, I attempt to show that Black women's active, engaged participation in the public street life, such as bars and nightclubs, and then their creation of private and semi-private social events like lesbian parties in their homes, and their involvement and leadership in important community institutions like the Black church. All these things allowed for the development of social networks and bonds of friendship among women and men with same-sex desire across all of those spaces. And so I'm arguing that there's a history of cultural invisibility of Black sexual minority women within Black communities and within LGBT communities. And I'm offering to the production of knowledge in this area 2 arenas where Black sexual minority women have historically had a significant presence. And that's the church and religious life, as well as the streets or informal economies that working-class women participated in. So I see these 2 arenas as having a simultaneous influence on the development of Black, lesbian, and LGBT culture. Through important race and class-based cultural traditions, Black women have profoundly shaped gay social life, including the language that lesbians use to describe same-sex desire, the style of clothing that they wear, the nature of the social interactions between patrons and partygoers, the types of music played in these spaces, and the ways their identities and practices are carried out. The historian Joan Nessel once said, "The reclamation of one's history is a direct political act that forces the birth of a new consciousness. It is the work that challenges both the hearer and the speaker." And so I draw from this perspective in sharing the unarticulated history of Black LGBT people and Black women in particular. In the time I have left, I want to share a portion of the life histories of 2 women who were both born in Harlem in 1940, 1 month apart, and I'm not sure that they know each other. Jean Jordan, who was a quote-unquote rough and tumble Black lesbian who grew up in Brooklyn and spent her teen years in the streets, engaged in the underworld of New York, and Jackie Brown, a Black lesbian born and raised in the church, as well as the bars in Harlem. So Jean Jordan was born in February 1940 in Harlem Hospital. She was a child of rape. She was born of rape, and her mother was 13 years old when she was born. And in her interviews, she describes a young life of living on the streets and running with a tough group of Black lesbians who actively participated in the underworld of New York City, and she calls it the underworld. She says they committed petty crimes and they got into trouble of various kinds. She also describes the long amounts of time that she spent in the bars in the 1950s and 60s, and the back and forth spent between the streets and the bars that made up her youth existence. She explains how she came to take advantage of opportunities in the 70s that offered women to return to school to earn a high school diploma, and then her life as a civil servant, eventually graduating from Queens College. And today she's retired, she owns a condo in Brooklyn, and she's not partnered. Now, she remembers that as early as her preteen years, from 1950 to 1953, she's always felt a little different than she imagined other girls to feel, but she couldn't figure out what it meant. When she was 13, she attended an all-girls high school, and this was the first place that she met other girls who were similar to her in their attraction to girls. She says that a person at the school told her about, quote, this house where people like me was, and at the age of 15, she ran away from home to live there. She describes this place as, quote, a house where there was a lot of prostitution, saying that there were prostitutes and then there were female homosexuals. And she says of the prostitutes, they had their own little room, and some of us, the female homosexuals, went with or dated the prostitutes. We, meaning the female homosexuals, didn't pay anything. She lived here for several years, and in the 1950s and 60s, lesbians and prostitutes overlapped in the few public spaces that they occupied. They had a shared history of struggle with the law, with religion, and with medicine, all attempting to explain and control the quote-unquote pathology of two groups of women who were and are concerned with creating power and autonomy for themselves in seemingly powerless social interactions. In my research, I've found that historically sexual minority women were involved in many forms of sex work, including work in bars with Johns, the work of overseeing women who are engaged in sexual activity for money as owners of brothels or as pimps, and people who might have hosted parties for truckers and travelers, who connected passersby, who might be looking to pay for sex and companionship for the night. Because of their relationships with different components of formal and informal economies, sexual minority women were key players, I argue, in connecting all different types of services, including sexual services. Now, in her younger years, Jean was what some might have called a hard-living woman. She came to understand herself as desiring women in the context of girls in her high school, as someone who spent time romantically with women who worked at a house of prostitution, and in relation to the object of her desire, which were feminine-presenting women. So for Jean, being romantically interested in women meant that she had to look and behave in particular ways that were masculine identified. In addition to dressing in men's clothes, she began to act like the men she would see in her neighborhood and at the brothel. She says she didn't know how to process her feelings of difference and had no one to talk to, and this produced an uncertainty that she describes in the following way. She says, you are on the outside looking in, and you don't know what to do or where to go or who to talk to. And you don't want to talk to just anybody because then they could think that you are crazy. But then you still want to lean over here to this side. And it appears that when you lean on the other side, you're supposed to get into some kind of trouble. That's what it was like when I was growing up. My way of thinking was really strange because I didn't understand where I was coming from. Then I didn't want to think about it either. So at that time, I think I was more like a follower. And if everybody was doing something, I said, okay, I will do it too. So for Jean, leaning to the other side meant accepting a lesbian sexuality as part of an overall deviance that included criminal activity and truancy. For her, people who desired women had to look and behave in ways that went against social norms. And so she brought these self-understandings with her into the bars and into her relationships. Now, Jackie Brown, or Miss Jackie, as she prefers to be called by those younger than herself, She describes a different life on the streets in the 1950s and 60s. Throughout her teenage years, she sang in the church choir, and as a young adult, she toured professionally with her family's singing group on the Chitlin circuit. Miss Jackie is and has always been an integral part of Black church life and the bar life. In 2010, she celebrated her 70th birthday. Friends and families packed the local gay dive bar while she sang "I Did It My Way" for late night karaoke. And apparently this was her thing. She used to close out the karaoke with "I Did It My Way." But then they also joined her a week later at the church, where they had an appreciation service for all of her work that she's done through the years to bring the people in the clubs and bars to church services. And indeed, many of the folks at the service looked like they had just come from the club. So Miss Jackie's experiences growing up were very different from those of Jean because she was well integrated into the community life and her family. She spent her youth selling dinners to neighbors, running numbers for her mom, and singing in the choir. And so she said, my mama always told me the villagers watching. So there was Mrs. Eveline that lived to the right of us on the top floor who could see our school from her window ledge. So we couldn't play hooky too much because Miss Eveline was gonna tell it. Then you had Mrs. Stewart that lived around the corner. My mama had a candy store, so everybody on 8th Avenue knew Mrs. Brown's children. My mother was a cook, so she cooked for the Apollo Theater, for the backstage, so that gave us another exposure, you know, running meals over to the theater and not knowing who we would get to meet. So she describes these intricate networks of children and adults at home, in the neighborhood, and at church. But like Jean, she also describes her same-sex attractions as feelings of difference. In 1957, when she was 16, she was sent to a detention house in upstate New York because she was caught dating the pastor's daughter. She stayed there for 4 weeks, and she was only allowed to return home after she promised never to see these type of women any longer. But when she returned to Harlem, she continued to see these young women romantically, and she eventually ran away from home. However, she says when we ran away from home, we were back in church on Sunday because singing in the choir was important to her. So we see this tension here between the pull of the church, the community, and the pursuit of same-sex desire. Her relationship with the church and with gay life was interdependent. She tells me of a park in Harlem, which it was Mount Morris Park, also called Marcus Garvey Park, where others with same-sex desire would hang out after church. And she says this park was your gay spot. All your funny folks met there in that park because that park opened a pathway to all your big churches. So when we played hooky from church, we all went to the park. In that era, you could go to the park, sit there and talk about church service and see who was at church. We called it the little connection spot. You stayed there until it was time to go back to church at 6 o'clock. We got out of church about 9:30, 10 o'clock. They had this bar on 125th and 8th Avenue called the Apollo Bar right across the street. It was from Daddy Grace Church on 125th. That's where we would all end up at. In 1959, Miss Jackie started singing with the Alex Bradford and the Bradford Specials, and she said it was a gospel group that she says was also a gay group. And she talks about a musical that they put on called the Jewel Box Review, and I was able to find an image of this in the archives. And she was the only woman in the group, and she played the part of a man. And at the end of the show, the audience had to guess who the real, quote-unquote, real woman was. The show ran for 6 weeks at the Apollo, and she says no one ever picked her as the woman. She refers to this period in life as the illusion era because many of the behaviors people partook in were different from what they tried to portray to larger society. And then she gives an example of ministers who preached against homosexuality even though they were gay, and she calls them your best of your phonies. So I see the historical influence of the Black religious faiths in aspects of contemporary Black gay social life. For example, at Black gay pride events, there's usually a gospel brunch, and many times there's a church service that pride goers attend. Music sets that are played by DJs in Black gay bars and nightclubs will incorporate songs that have gospel lyrics set to house music beats. There are drag performances where the crowd lip syncs to popular gospel songs, and the people there, we sing these songs along with the performer. Sometimes we spontaneously break into a soul clap or start a call and response. So folks will be at the bar on Saturday night and in the church pew on Sunday, and these events are not typically part of pride events for the general population. So I'll stop here, and I'm just trying to show how aspects of African American life, drawn from the cultural traditions and multiple oppressions that we've experienced, play an important role in the construction of Black lesbian and gay identities and in the social worlds of Black queer people. And my goal is to chart a sociocultural history of Black LGBT identity and experience as it relates to the corresponding social forces around Black power, civil rights, women's rights, LGBT rights. And I hope that this is a foundational work in sociology and perhaps other areas, but I know that I've been drawing from the work of Black women historians that has really informed my thinking. And I'd like us to think about these things in sociology to understand the movements and the populations that have been affected by those experiences. So thank you.
I want to thank all of our panelists. These papers have given us just a taste of the innovative and wide-ranging Black feminist work across disciplines, work that makes us rethink so much, including notions and conceptions of time, work that provides examples that ask us to cross or trouble boundaries between the street and the church, to imagine insurgent retributive feminist implications of Black women throughout history, work that demonstrates the way that contemporary Black women have transformed the workplace, electoral, and movement politics, as well as media and culture. Together, these papers show us how Black women, sex workers, conventional or organic intellectuals, political leaders, writers, and everyday people have much to teach us about dismantling systems of oppression and inequality, and how they also provide us with tools as we seek to build this world anew. So I want to thank each of these wonderful, wonderful papers, and then open it up for questions. We have about 10 minutes.
Yes, thank you for a wonderful panel. My question is for Brittany, as someone who identifies as Indigenous, I really appreciate you connecting and centering colonialism and indigeneity with this panel and your talk. And I was wondering about this idea of linking temporality and territory, right? And the idea of that taking up of space is because they took our land, right? And I was wondering if that was going to be part of your project, or if you're thinking about that connection, or what if your thoughts on that?
Yeah, part of the argument is really basically that the kind of sleight of hand of white supremacy is that they're actually the space takers. And that they've sort of reframed it so that everyone else is taking up space. I mean, the core argument of gentrification is that we have to move all of these people away because they are, stalling progress, right? We want to bring neighborhoods into the 21st century. We want to reflect diversity, right? We want to renew. All of those are arguments about a sort of liberal, temporal notion, white notion of progress. And they are predicated on the idea that it's fine to evacuate and exterminate peoples from land, which is why the logic is so similar. And so what actually happens is that whiteness sort of works by deciding that territory belongs to it, and then reframing everyone else who is there as peoples who are space takers. And they also then do that in an ideology of whiteness by making the claim that the world-making projects that are happening in those places don't matter.
Thank you all for the papers. I really enjoyed the session. And it's a question kind of directed to Callie and Harvey Wingfield.
Yeah.
Did I pronounce it right?
Well, my first name's Adia. That's fine.
Okay, I cannot see that. I'm sorry. But I was just thinking about the two papers together, and I just started to. Part of the question is wondering, Callie, what you were saying about retributive
Retributive feminism.
feminism. and what you were describing with the badges, I was wondering in what way can you see like a politics that might be informed by what you're describing? It may or may not be retributive feminism, but could it still be instructive for politics? And then how would that fit into the frame that you were laying out, which seemed to signal kind of a formal electoral politics, but then more of an activist-oriented politics? Maybe just kind of bringing them together in a question.
Okay. So, well, thank you for the question. So in some ways, I'm not certain that it would necessarily fit in with, I think, the kind of politics that Adia has framed out. But I do think that it is informing a political ideology. I actually think that it is leaning a lot more towards almost like a nihilistic kind of action, which I actually think could be powerful in certain ways. Like, it's, you know, in some respects, like they've let go of the rope. You know, it's like, you know, you get to end the rope, make this knot and hold on. Like, I think this is the complete opposite. That folks have decided that like these rules are fixed, this notion of like what's right and wrong is perverted and hypocritical. And so, you know, we will make our own way, and, you know, by sort of these acts that are in part about, certainly informed by poverty and desperation, but I think also vengeance. So I see them as having a critical analysis of racism, sexism, and patriarchy. But that for them, I don't know that they see a real sort of way out of it. Like, you know, they may very well be like early forerunners for like Afro-pessimism or something, right? They're like, you know, there's this sort of ontological system at work that is not necessarily going to change, but that doesn't mean that they can't get their own sort of, you know, that they can kind of have their comeuppance too. But I do think the lesson that, you know, we might want to consider with this sort of, you know, this complete kind of, you know, sort of this nihilistic action in some respects, is that it does manage to confound the state, which I find especially interesting. And so I think that there is something to be said for thinking about the ways that we resist going forward. You know, so much of the resistance narrative now is framed around a politics of nonviolence and also like an adherence to the law and like the rules, right? And I think that has its place. But I think that, you know, certainly throughout African American history and certainly diasporic history, right, that violence has also been an effective means to resist oppression. And the fact that these women are finding ways to seize on it and use it in these spaces and manage to elude punishment from the state, I think is something that is important and could potentially inform a politics of resistance that's outside of these other means.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. The only thing that I would add dovetails with your comments on resistance, which is where I think that the Black feminist framework that I've employed is so useful, because a big part of what Hollins wants to do is to push us to center Black women in ways that allow us to think more critically about various aspects of Black women's lives, including but not limited to resistance, right? So I think that this Black feminist approach gives a more nuanced, or allows us to have a more nuanced assessment of what you're talking about as a form of resistance, and one that's born out of these intersecting struggles responding to racism, sexism, capitalism, and so forth, in ways that I think wouldn't necessarily be as visible without that sort of theoretical approach.
Thank you all, and I just want to say on behalf of so many people in the audience, you know, you can reclaim as much time as you want. This has been a really rewarding panel. I have a quick question for Professor Moore, and I can talk later if it's too specific for this forum, but I was very excited to see the Jewel Box Review flash on the screen, and you talked briefly in the context of one of your oral histories about, I'm forgetting the name, but someone that she performed in the Jewel Box Review as that was the question, because done some research on Stormy DeLarverie, who also performed, and I was wondering if that name came up, and just in general, if there was more. I mean, the received history of DeLarverie, so much as I know it, is that she was the one female-bodied person involved in the review. But if there were more, especially over the length of the history of the review, that would be. I'm just excited to hear more about that, and if that forms part of the oral history of the larger research objective to think about the social life of Black, queer, and trans performance in the review.
So Stormy doesn't come up in Ms. Jackie's interview, but in the course of my research, I've learned quite a bit about Stormy in different arenas, including this arena. This particular context was Ms. Jackie in her group, but that was just one aspect of the kind of singing work and performance work that she did. And so there's a queer historian whose name escapes me right now, but is in my larger paper, who writes about this, about the performative, what this queer performance does in this particular historical context for the exposure and development of community for people of color. Ms. Jackie was really engaged in her life and in the different aspects of her life. And it was almost a race against time because she had developed some dementia that progressed over the years. So the 2010 event that when I talked about the appreciation service for her, you could already start to see some signs of it. And so for her, it was really just about getting out her story. And so there were parts that she wanted to continue with that we just never were able to continue with. So she didn't mention Stormy in the 2 interviews that I did with her, but that doesn't mean that it wasn't part of her larger experience.
So let's take these 3 questions together, and then if you want to address them first with Mabel, and then next to, yes, and then Dan.
Great, and thank you all, I think, for really fantastic presentations and very provocative. And I was thinking about the question of space makers and world takers and how much of the space-time is colonized and quantified. Clocks break down into minutes. Space is square feet, and literally square feet per dollars as we sit in a room filled with grids. And I was wondering, like, the concept of being able to steal away, to take away your time and find another place. And how do we, particularly as Black women, find that? And I think, Callie, you talk about literally confounding the system, which is to in a way, take from it, right? And I'm wondering, like, what spaces and what kinds of times can we find, given the way in which life is so regimented and institutionalized and policed? And I felt like, Mignon, you sort of mentioned that when Jackie says, I just go to the park, right? We're not in the trip, but we're in the park discovering something else. And I'm wondering, how do we think about maybe those kinds of spaces and that time where we find these new kinds of identities and social relations and imaginaries? And maybe you can speak to it in your relative work.
My question is to Professor Wingfield. Your presentation was spot on and timely. Particularly, you introduced, in Reclaiming Politics, your notion of the lack of party support for Black candidates. And just this past week, we had a the People conference that was organized, politicized, but it was embedded in the historical Black College of Texas Southern. Yay, I'm a Texan. How much do you believe that the venue, the space where we convene our politics, will have an impact on our using that space as a springboard for our voices to be resonated throughout the world?
Oh, sorry. Am I?
There'll be one more, then we'll take, yeah. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you for a really wonderful panel. I'm still trying to sort out my question. I was really moved, Imabong, am I saying your name right?
Yeah, you're close enough. It's fine.
I was so moved by your paper. You really brought to life a certain kind of, on the one hand, isolation that colonial subjects would have been feeling in Britain and France, and the kind of internationalism that came out of that. Like the way that you made black feminism in Europe something that was intrinsically internationalist was just beautiful. And I thought that these are the kinds of histories that we don't hear. And I was really just so moved by your essay. And it got me to thinking about how, what are the conditions of possibility in the United States for black feminists to also be internationalist. We have a lot of, I know, black American political history is full of internationalism, of course, but it struck me on contrasting your essay to the other 4 essays that yours was so just profoundly globally black and feminist. So I wonder if we might explain that through the kind of crude contrast between US black experience and post-colonial/colonial black experience in Europe.
Thank you all so much. And this is a question I'm happy to follow through with you, Professor Cooper, and everyone, thanks again. I was so delighted by you drawing for your evidence 2 of my favorite things, poetry and divas. And in particular, and thinking about Morgan Parker in particular in her first book, There Are More Beautiful Things Than Beyonce.
Yeah.
Wondering if you could talk at some point about what it is about the diva, particularly the black popular diva figure generally, or perhaps, or Beyonce in particular, that is providing an opportunity for, I think, so many artists and scholars to think through black feminism. Like, what is it for you about that figure, either particularly or more generally?
Okay, terrific. I think we're done, though. I don't think we can do any more questions. All right, so first question about space makers. Mabel's question about what does it mean to steal away? Are there possibilities to steal away, to take time? What kinds of spaces and times can we find? A second one is how much does venue, the spaces where we convene, shape our politics? Will it have an impact on our politics? The question about sort of globally thinking about black feminism is also for black feminists to be internationalists. What are the conditions by which U.S. black feminists can become internationalists and globalists? And the last one was the question about poetry and divas. What is it about the black diva figure that provides opportunities for us to think through some of these issues? So.
My 2 short answers on the stealing away question. I think there's an embedded thing about self-care, which, is, take the time wherever you can. But I'm actually trying to do something a bit broader, which is, I think the self-care conversation is vitally important, but I'm actually trying to say that I'm tired of the self-care conversation because it becomes so deeply capitalist, and that I'm interested in how do you actually change the structure so that black women are not always overworked, so that they are seen, so that we have the opportunity to be girls and then to be women, and to not have all of those things be collapsed. And so, for instance, one of the things I'm going to do in the book project that is going to come out of this work is talk about the black maternal mortality crisis as being rooted in all of that research around weathering that says that essentially, even though black don't crack on the outside, on the inside, it actually ages really fast. And so I'm trying to think about the structural stealing of time. And so I'm saying what happens is that black women politically internalize this as an individual solution, and we could talk about that as black feminist praxis, but in the end, we're not engaged in a freedom project if we don't sort of restructure the way that the world is set up. And so that's why it has to be a sort of big conception about how does time look different if you actually tell the story from a different point of view. And then the question about Beyonce is just that she's dope, and you know, look, I know that I think academics like to hate on Beyonce because she's deeply contradictory. She's in process. She light-skinned, and people don't trust light-skinned chicks. I mean, real talk, like any number of things. But we're about the same age. We're from the same region of the country. We grew up in the same kind of context. She's a Southern Black woman who grew up on Southern hip hop. She's very sort of unapologetic about that. Those things really resonate with me. I also like that in a moment where she could have gone mainstream pop and everyone hated her in like 2013, 2014, she came back in 2016 and was like, I'm actually very Black. I'm Houston Black. I'm Gulf South Black. I think those things are really important, and it informs. I want to just say one last little thing, which is I struggle with that question about being a Black feminist internationalist, in part because, one, when I look at the archive, Black women have always talked about like internationalism, even in the US. Like you think about the International Council of Women of the Darker Races in the 1920s. And so I sometimes also get a question in my work about, well, what about the global whatever? Like, and I'm trying to figure out how you balance that Black Americans shouldn't be at the center of what we mean when we say Black feminism, at the same time that I'm like, but much of what we do is we study the places we come from to try to make sense of them. I'm a Black girl from the South, and I want to talk about Black women in the U.S. South, and then what does it mean for us to sort of have a freedom project? And so how do you do that in a world where sometimes in the academy, one of the things that we're actually doing is saying to African American scholars and African Americanists that's not the hip shit anymore to talk about Blackness just from a U.S. perspective because it's so deeply centered. And so we're asking people to sort of think outwardly in ways that, for me, feel like y'all not hot no more, so you don't get to be at the center of the conversation. And I'm like, well, how do we center in the U.S. context without taking over the world? To me, that's the question, right? Yeah.
I just wanted to chime in really quickly. Thanks so much for that question. And I was thinking that, and for me, there's a way in which Badgers, I think, kind of steal their time back by not doing domestic service, that in engaging in those activities, they're able to avoid the grind of having to work, 5, possibly 6 days a week, maybe with the afternoon off for church, right, in white homes, that those activities give them the financial sort of freedom to avoid that work.
Can I say something at that point?
In some of the archives I've looked at, we see some kind of relationship of badger theft among lesbians. In the bars, women who are masculine identified and are still engaging in these kinds of activities. So I was thinking about, I was really appreciated Callie's work, and I was just thinking about these questions around space and time and the creation of new ideas and a consciousness. And so I'm grappling with them in this chapter on work and leisure. So what do these women do for fun? What do they do for work, right? So they could remain independent, and what were the spaces that they created that eventually become something called a community around sexual identity. So I am thinking about the use of space and autonomy, and how you create autonomy, and if it takes place in some unscrupulous ways, what does that mean? In a time where it's hard to make ends meet by yourself, and they're working to do that, and they're taking on these different kinds of work and in these different spaces and using these spaces to carve out something. So I don't have a clear answer, but I am thinking about it in those kinds of ways.
I think that your comments go back to your question about venue, right, in a broad sense, right? Because so to briefly answer your question, I think that that venue matters enormously, right? But it matters enormously because it's a window or a marker of when, whether, and how people are being fully represented and brought into spaces, right? And I had to rush through my presentations. There was a lot I couldn't say out of time constraints. But one of the things that I would have said if I had more time to talk was to make this point, or elaborate on this point more about how I think this is a significant shift when it comes to these conversations that we're having about Black women in politics. Black women have long been very actively involved in politics and social movements and social change. But if we're talking about electoral politics, this is a space now where there's starting to be more, I think, mainstream visible discussion about just how much Black women have put into particularly electoral politics on the Democratic side and how little we have gotten back, and how this is now a time to have this conversation to say this ends today, this stops, right? Enough is enough. And now you listen to us because we have had your back for so long, it is time to put back in. But I also want to say that in the context of emphasizing that when I talk about this question of reclaiming their time in Black women's involvement in politics, this isn't to suggest that kind of the Democratic Party is kind of where it's at and where answers are, right? Clearly, there are so many issues and problems in that political party that I don't even think we have time to go into in the short space that's left. But I do think that one of the things that's important about this conversation about venues is that having it in, or when spaces that are historically Black and culturally Black are places where we are talking about issues and politics and things that are central and necessary and important to and for Black women, that's critical and that matters. And that's the beginning of a discussion that I think needs to have, that I hope is followed by actual action. And I think that's why it's so significant to think and talk about venues and the spaces where these types of conversations and these types of discussions are having. I don't see this as being kind of an endpoint, but I see it as being potentially a beginning and a shift in the sort of conversations and discussions that we need to be having. And a shift, again, hopefully in the sort of action that needs to get taken as well.
Oh, and I would just quickly add to say that also Black feminism has had there's been a long internationalist trend within Black feminism. And I also want to also be careful not to kind of pit nationalism and the transnational as diametrically opposed, but oftentimes it's actually quite overlapping and it's being linked, not so much as being the international is the focus and the nation is forgotten, but actually there's a much more closer relationship between those two categories in Black feminism historically.
So, this was a wonderful panel, and I just also wanted to say I'm wondering, this is something we can talk about later, as I was listening to Imobang's presentation, that sometimes when we focus on, when Black women intellectuals, which has been a lot of my work too, is the focus, it's easier for us to find some of these connections, the kind of internationalist connections, and less so when we shift our gaze from the kind of political activists and intellectuals and look at the sex workers, or, and that maybe what I'm hearing is a challenge for us to also think about how to have conversations about women who are working class or not working in the conventional ways that broadens our framework. Like, does it mean we look at them in different contexts? Does it mean, where might they rub up against each other? But it seems like a really important question that's more challenging when we aren't looking at kind of the educated, the intellectual, the politically activists conventionally. So thank you so much. This was so wonderful.
Awesome.